to why data stewardship matters. And I want to start today by really reflecting on kind of the recent developments as it relates to the Nobel Prize. Many of you have followed last week the announcement of several Nobel Prize winners, whether it was in physics, economics, and so on. But I think when there was, anyway, when you look at all those prizes, and especially the ones in kind of physics and also economics, then you can start really realizing that none of those scholars and scientists would have been able to get a Nobel Prize if they would not have had access to high quality data. And I think it's a really important aspect to perhaps reflect on, that without access to high quality data, science cannot progress. And my point of view is that the Nobel Prize should actually recognize the need for this kind of data infrastructure that really is necessary and should be nurtured moving forward. And
So
anyway,
I'm missing that.
and that was
See what's going on. Just trying to show that I.
There we go. And I think that's also something that I think we should recognize more, is that without data stewardship and access to data, we really would not have the kind of Nobel laureates and the Nobel Prize winners that we saw today. And that was also the topic of an article that I wrote with my colleagues at the Data Tank. And for those that are interested, we can share that as well. But I thought I would start here because the Nobel Prize obviously was kind of a big event. But unfortunately, from my point of view, it was not enough recognized that actually data was the underpinning, and especially access to high quality data and non-traditional data in many cases was the underpinning of a lot of the kind of Nobel Prize winners as well. And another element that I think is becoming more and more pronounced, and that's especially when we enter the kind of non-traditional data, is that there's also a broader recognition that if we want to advance, for instance, diagnosis, and we actually really want to advance earlier prevention of certain kind of diseases, then it is also important to have access to non-traditional data, such as, for instance, search data. This is here, I share this example, and these are, by the way, all recent examples, right? So that's why I wanted to make sure that all those examples kind of give you a zeitgeist of where we are with regard to data and data stewardship. But this example here comes from the UK, where they are really trying to advance this notion of smart data or access to non-traditional data. And in this case, this is, of course, search data, where they have identified that actually keywords can be proxies. If you start doing some searches, for instance, for certain kinds of relief or certain kinds of how do I deal with X, that could actually be indication of a certain kind of condition. And there are all kinds of studies now that actually have shown that if you would take those keywords and you would analyze them, you would actually be able to alert and have some kind of a early stage diagnosis, or at least an indication that something might be wrong that needs further search as well. Now, the question is, of course, how do you do this in a privacy enhancing manner? And how do you go about this in a kind of a systematic as well? The other kind of example that is kind of from another field is this recent book that was released, which was really more about complex science and complex systems, but then applied to urban development. And I think it was interesting. Again, key message from the book is that, anyway, without actually having access to non-traditional data, whether this is kind of telco data or whether it's data from, for instance, Internet of Things, but also, anyway, combine it with traditional data, open data quite often, then it's going to be very hard to really understand how you go about managing complex systems such as cities. And of course, a lot of the experimentation these days happens in kind of the creation of digital twins. And it's also kind of one of the applications where data is more and more required. But without having data stewardship that really can help facilitate access to data in a more systematic, sustainable, and responsible way, it's going to be very hard to advance urban science and very hard to actually really leverage those urban twins as well. And some of you might have also experience with that. Other example here, which is then more, again, in the kind of the health space, is a report that was released, I think 2 weeks ago, by an organization in Australia, actually, called Reach Out, where they actually also have done some work on how can we start using social media and monitoring of social media and sentiment analysis to understand kind of mental health crisis among adolescents as well. And again, another example that certain data is very hard to obtain otherwise, because if you depend on surveys, it's quite often too late, or it's quite often reported behavior. But if you really start understanding, for instance, certain kinds of signals that are present in social media, you might be able to also have a better sense of the situation. Then this, I thought, was kind of an interesting article and paper, which then specifically focused on open data, open government data. And so, as you all know, there has been a long-standing challenge to really document value, right? And quite often causality between the release of open data and whether actually it makes impact. And this paper actually goes and tries to make a correlation between, on the one hand, environments and regions that have open data, and then compare that with to what extent are they more innovative, to what extent are they more advanced with regard to technological kind of opportunities. And there turns out that there is a correlation between regions that provide open data and actually more innovative activity, more startup activity, for instance, so more economic opportunities, versus regions that have no open data, where then also there is a decline or a kind of a poor ranking with regard to economic innovation. And so it would be interesting because I remember, for instance, when we were talking and having the boot camp in Berlin, we also had this kind of dashboard of kind of, anyway, open data across different German states. It would be interesting whether that can also be then correlated with actually doing better or worse. Now, the key question, of course, from my point of view, is, anyway, perhaps the fact that they were already more innovative actually led to actually providing open data, and whether, anyway, that's kind of a correlation that actually might be reversed as well. But at least I think it was an interesting example and an interesting study that tried to document some of the impact. And I think it's super important for data stewards to be able to show that actually having open data or releasing open data has some kind of a positive impact on the economy as well. Now, there are all kinds of also studies that show the reverse. If you don't have access to data, what is then the implication? And this is, for instance, a recent example where they show that having no access to data also contributes to actually more inequity. And this was a case where there's a clear correlation between access to, for instance, utilities or being able to afford utilities and communities of color. But unfortunately, the problem is very poorly understood, and as a result, is also not taken into account when designing policies, when designing, for instance, policies with regard to inclusion, with regard to particular kind of affordability aspects as well. And this is, again, an example where data stewardship matters, because in this case, it's a clear example that data could actually contribute to better advocacy for certain kinds of conditions. But absent that, it's very hard to actually make a case that this is a topic worth exploring. Now, interestingly enough, I think there are, because, anyway, I show those examples mainly because we still, anyway, have quite often a real task to make the case for providing access to data. And that's why I start with that. But quite often, I think it's also important to reinvigorate kind of why all of this matters. And what is interesting is kind of this, I think, was released today or yesterday, is actually, for instance, Scotland, who has realized that indeed they started off with open data, and then they had like an, anyway, kind of a really invigorating moment when open data was kind of the important thing to do. But obviously, as in many cases, and that's also why, as some of you might know, I've called this the emergence of a data winter. In many cases, we see some of the excitement and the enthusiasm around data floundering. And what's happening here is that Scotland basically has realized that they need to restate the vision for public sector data. And I think it's a really, if you check it out, it's a really interesting exercise that is kind of multi-stakeholder, where they really try to say, well, why does data matters? And especially why does access to public sector data matter? And that is kind of a reinvigoration of kind of the open data community as well. And I thought that was kind of interesting that it actually is kind of reestablishing a vision. And I think it's a good example, and it's something that, from my point of view, should happen on a regular basis, right? Because clearly, anyway, as I said, 10 years ago, open data in many places was kind of seen as the thing to do. But I think it's time for actually restating that vision and updating it, from my point of view, especially at a time when you, of course, have also AI, and that's what we'll see is kind of becoming the dominant narrative as well as it relates to data stewardship. Now, there were also a whole range of recent articles that have emerged where actually data stewardship really was featured out as kind of the next profession that is needed, especially when it comes to AI. And we will see, anyway, some of you might have seen this as well, is that data stewardship has only become more important, mainly because, on the one hand, of course, you need a lot of data for instance, AI training models, which quite often is not fundamentally accessible. But more importantly, it's also about curation and about really ensuring that it's high quality and that you have actually the social license for using the data that is out there. And this is kind of one example of kind of, anyway, the CIO.com, so the innovation officers that have shown that actually data stewardship becomes more important. And this is the recent State of AI report. Some of you might have seen it as well. It's kind of a, I mean, if you haven't seen it, highly recommend, anyway, if you're interested in kind of the evolution of the AI ecosystem. It's kind of the pretty dense report on the current state of Gen AI and how it is evolving that was released, I think, 2 weeks ago. And so one slide I thought was super interesting, because it's also the recognition that, again, and we will see this also, that data actually is the fundamental building block, of course, for AI, and that it's not just about getting data, but it's also about curation. And that's, from my point of view, where data stewardship comes in. And I think also that is actually going to be a more important role and function for data stewards moving forward. Is this kind of curatorial function that is going to be important to not just describe data, but also to curate it in a way that creates value. And then the question is, of course, how do you go about this kind of curation as well? So these were just to get us started, a few recent, and again, I always try to keep it like the last month or the last 2 months, some recent developments that show again the value of data. And I think as a community, we cannot ignore the importance of constantly stating the value of data and pointing to kind of examples where access to social media data, or access to open data, or access to, for instance, cell phone data in the context of urban planning is actually fundamental to making progress on a few societal challenges as well. Now, this is kind of the good news, is that actually data is being used and value has been created. Now, what is the main, I think, from the last 6 months or so, the main narrative, however, when it comes to data, is what I call the data winter, right? As some of you know, I do believe that we actually are at a unique moment in time where we see a decline in access to data, and where we see kind of the commitments that existed with regard to data kind of backsliding. And I've shared some of that already in previous talks, so I'm not going to repeat that here. But we do have a first mile problem. And typically, anyway, some of you might know, from my point of view, in the data space, there are many problems, right? But the two big ones are the first mile problem, which is how do we have access to data? And then we have the last mile problem, which is how do we actually go from insight to action, right? Because if you have insight, it doesn't matter if no one, anyway, it doesn't matter whether you have the insight if no one acts upon it. And I think that's a unique data stewardship function as well, which is really about how do we accelerate and provide access, but then how do we make sure that if you have access, that impact is also obtained by making sure that the insights are being used as well. And so let the first focus on the kind of first mile problems. And there was a whole range of articles that were published in many places, whether it was The Economist, the Financial Times, and so on. And some of you might have seen this as well, where there is a clear understanding that actually access to data becomes harder and harder. And also that from an AI perspective, we are running out of data for the next generation of kind of large language models. And that's what I meant by the data winter. So we have the so-called AI summer, where every day, and this could be another screenshot that I would have introduced perhaps, but every day there's a release of another kind of model. And because the question is, to what extent is that sustainable? But it's definitely not going to be sustainable if we don't figure out how to provide access to data in less extractive models, right? Because that's been the challenge so far, is that most of the access has been fairly extractive by scraping. Of course, some would say, oh, well, it's different when you do crawling, which is less extractive perhaps. But at the same time, we see a decline in actually access to data. And this is now clearly recognized. This is also an example here by a study that was done by Data Provenance Initiative at MIT that basically showed that indeed kind of the data sets are rapidly disappearing and that there is a steady decline of having access to data. And of course, while this is applied to AI, my statement here is that it might be harder to get access to data for AI, but that also means that it's going to be harder to have access for data for everything else as well. So it's not just AI, but it actually has this kind of rundown effect that people are going to start closing their data for other purposes as well. Now, the other big question, of course, and that's something from a data stewardship perspective that is also important to take into account. The other big news, well, not news, but development, is, of course, that many are trying to address this kind of data winter by then leveraging the data that is being generated by the models itself, right? And so it's interesting that now you actually have data creation by the models, and that is now being used also for then using it for further training or even for, in some cases, analysis. Now, many have pointed that is actually problematic. Surprise, surprise. More and more problematic from kind of reinvigorating the bias that is already there, right? And then you actually start eating your kind of dog food. But more importantly, many are also predicting that this might lead to actually a model collapse because of the lack of human data and because of the lack of actually access to data as well. Now, this is just to give a flavor that it becomes a real issue. And it also, by the way, from my point of view, it is also a real opportunity. And it's a real opportunity because now actually the big players realize that access to data is fundamental. And I think from a data stewardship perspective, it becomes real opportunity to actually come up with new models. And I will point you to a few of those in a second, which is, for instance, kind of data commons, right? How do we develop data commons that really can provide for more fair and equitable access to data, and also do this kind of data curation of data as well. And I think that's the kind of the other coin of the model collapse, is that actually all the big players start to realize that they cannot keep doing what they've been doing. And as a result, there's this opportunity for actually kind of new models of open data, which, as some of you have also called the fourth generation of open data as well, where we actually have data commons emerge that complement open data. The other thing I need to mention, of course, which I forgot, when it comes to AI training data, which is also, by the way, a big realization for the open data community, is that we are not just talking about tabular data anymore, but that when we talk about data for AI, it's also, of course, and mainly unstructured data. And I think the open data community and the data stewards community is going to have to realize that it's not just about tabular data anymore, but actually about also unstructured data, including multimodal kind of data, such as voice, such as video, that all becomes kind of important to have access to, because all that content, all that data can actually now be used and analyzed for a variety of purposes as well. So that's kind of trying to close the kind of the AI space. Now, at the same time, of course, we also see that other data is being closed down, such as climate data, which then is linked to kind of the decline in open science in certain areas. I mean, open science was kind of the fundamental paradigm when it was applied to climate science. But what we see is that because people are actually willing now to pay for climate data in order to measure, for instance, ESG indicators and so on, we see that actually a lot of that open science data is now not available anymore and is being closed down. And that's especially, of course, problematic in kind of the global south, where it's also already hard to get access to data, but now there's kind of an additional layer of extraction there that is problematic. Now, what we do see then is that those that can afford buying climate data are now using data as kind of a competitive distinguishing factor. And I thought it was interesting to see what, for instance, in the US, what happened with Zillow. Zillow is the largest real estate kind of information broker. So if you want to buy a house, or you want to, and again, our colleagues here from the US, I'm sure will know Zillow. Basically, that's the place where you go to see what was the price in the past and what's then kind of the expected price you can get from a property that you may own. Now, what is Zillow doing is now actually providing climate risk assessments of every property in the US, which is super interesting because, of course, it requires access to climate data. But it also, and again, would be eager to hear from Jamie perhaps, it also means that they actually have sometimes better climate risk assessments than local officials who still try to struggle sometimes to think in terms of how will climate change affect their region, and then also will impact the kind of planning purposes to decide where to put, for instance, affordable housing, or where to put kind of the next urban infrastructure as well. But you see that, you know, on the one hand, you have climate data being closed. On the other hand, it becomes kind of a competitive edge if you have access to data to lock in certain kinds of customers as well. Now, this has been not a silent movement, right? So it's not like, anyway, what I mentioned about the data winter, that I've been the only one, or we've been the only one calling out. Actually, we see a lot of activity against this kind of extractive behavior, and also against the data winter. One was, for instance, where a whole bunch of scientists signed a call for action in order to have access to platform data, because that's obviously at a time of massive electoral behavior and activity, is kind of super important to have access to to platform data to understand certain kinds of disinformation campaigns, for instance. But others have also started calling for being less dependent on actually digital, taking away the kind of the asymmetries and dependencies that exist. And so we see a lot of that called up. And that also means that there are a whole bunch of kind of proposals And of course, we have been working on, as I said, kind of proposals with regard to the data commons, but we've also been working on kind of how do you make data AI ready, which is the other big topic, by the way, as well. But here are just a few kind of proposals. One, anyway, where they start to call for kind of public data banks. And it's interesting that I'm actually working on a piece at the moment trying to compare some activity at the national level, like the UK is developing kind of a national data lake. The US is developing a national data service. And then you have a few others that are trying to come up with kind of national data banks. And I think that's kind of one way where some countries are trying to develop. The key question here is, for instance, do we need kind of a national data commons that then can be that can provide fair access to certain data so that everyone has kind of the same kind of training data access so that there is more competition in the space, for instance, but also for anyway, other purposes as well. The other element, of course, has been synthetic data. I mean, some have said, well, we cannot get new data, but then we can create synthetic data. And this piece here was kind of interesting to point that synthetic data obviously is not nirvana, but that actually there are a whole range of challenges with synthetic data with regard to quality loss and also with regard to as exactly kind of the biases that are creeping in. This is a report that was published this week by Mozilla. Anyway, just to show that there's a lot of activity in that space where they, anyway, try to also advocate for research access, because one of the key challenges, of course, is that AI research is actually now, anyway, exclusively almost done by the large corporate actors. And in order to, anyway, maintain certain AI research at the kind of scientific level, you need to actually have access to models as well. Now, this is kind of the first mile problems. And let me, I don't know what the, let me quickly go to the last mile problems and then round it off and then open it up for reactions and comments. So as I said, from a data stewardship perspective, it's very important to think about, anyway, so what, anyway, how do we, what's the value of access, and then what is the current developments? And again, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but obviously we are in kind of a moment in time when, anyway, data becomes either more important, but also becomes more enclosed. Now, the question is, of course, what then happens at the last mile? And so what we see is that actually the last mile is also problematic when it comes to actually using insight and evidence with regard to data. And so one article here clearly indicates, so the one that we said we've got a big problem, is by a group of researchers that basically have indicated is that we actually don't know in the social innovation sector, we don't really know what works. And that there is actually very little evidence and data being generated that actually would allow for more insight as well. Then anyway, there's also an article that was released, I think, last week, which basically says that, well, there is a lot of evidence, we just don't use it, which is the other kind of big challenge, right? So now we have a lot of kind of insight with regard to what works, what does not work, but we just don't use it. And that's then kind of a design failure to go from scientific insight to then policymaking, this translational kind of challenge that we have. And then the other article is by some colleagues actually at New York University, Rumi, but then also others that are based in other places, which basically then also says that, okay, a lot of the evidence that is being generated might actually not be as valuable unless you actually also get actually the domain experts involved. And that's then a key question with regard to the bilinguals that we need in today's world that understand a particular domain, but also understand, of course, how data is and can be used as well. Now, what's been the proposal? And again, there's a, as I said, it was interesting that the last kind of 2 months or so, there's been a lot of proposals to improve the way we go about the last mile, the way we go about then evidence and integrating evidence. One proposal here in the Financial Times was about creating evidence banks, which is kind of interesting. where you would anyway have kind of evidence in regard to particular kind of interventions that would be collated into a bank that then can be accessed by policymakers and that would be updated on a regular basis. The other one, which also is interesting, is actually very strong investments, like the Wellcome Trust in the UK is starting to invest in this notion of living evidence, where they actually would apply both AI and collective intelligence in order to constantly updating what we know about particular kind of events. And this is not just about healthcare, it's also about other societal developments. And so this evidence synthesis infrastructure would allow this kind of living evidence to emerge. And of course, this is where AI actually can be extremely valuable to also start analyzing and constantly updating evidence. And then the other example I have there is kind of the social systems evidence. It's been in practice for a while, but it actually recently got like upgraded again. And this is kind of an evidence bank on how we are doing with regard to the Sustainable Development Goals, and also how anyway, how all of this can then influence policy making as well. So this is kind of the last smile. I'm just going to reflect on a few policy developments that might be interesting. The one here is from the US, but you see this now in many countries emerge as well. What has happened in the US is that the Department of Commerce actually has issued a call for information or request for information, because they started to realize that a lot of the data that was available on their open data platform, and the Department of Commerce is the largest data holder in government in the US. They have NOAA, they have census, and so on. And they started realizing that in order to maintain their position as kind of a data provider to society, they also have to start thinking about how do we make our data actually AI ready. And I think this has been a really interesting exercise, and also a really interesting kind of refocus of the open data community, which, as already mentioned, is not just about how do we make open data reusable as we knew it in the past, but also how do we make data AI ready so that actually models start using open data and start using official data. Because the reason why they were interested in this is because they have a mandate, of course, to provide official data and to inform society. And they saw that most people actually started to get their information from generative AI queries. And most, if not all of those generative AI queries were not based, and the answers were not based upon official data. So they saw there's a real problem, and that their data was not used. And the reason why the data was not used is because it was not AI ready. And so that's kind of a big topic in the open data space. And there have been quite, anyway, it would be interesting for those who are interested, there was quite a lot of submissions. One submission here was to create, and that's, as I said, something that we work on now, was to actually create government data commons. This was a submission by Microsoft, but also by others that have been advocating for data commons that would be accessible to all, and that would contain AI-ready kind of government data, right? And that would not just be tabular data, but also would be kind of more and more the kind of multimodal kind of data that is important. Now, the other thing that has happened, and again, perhaps Otávio can reflect on that as well, of course, we had a lot of activity at the G20 in Brazil, and in order to inform that, a really interesting report was released by the OECD, which was this G20 compendium that actually anyway listed quite a lot of interesting examples on how data access data access to private sector data can inform public interest purposes as well. So I highly recommend having a look at that if you haven't seen it yet. And then, of course, the big news came from the UN, where finally, after 3 years, the Global Digital Compact was kind of adopted. Now, what is interesting in the Global Digital Compact is, of course, their commitment and their call to prioritize access to data, right? And they even use the term data commons, that they are committed to actually create data commons. And so it's going to be interesting to see how does that then relate with kind of the AI-ready data commons as well? And then, of course, in parallel, during the United Nations General Assembly was the release of the Governing AI for Humanity report, which was released by the AI Advisory Group to the UN. And again, very interesting, where data governance finally got recognized as kind of a building block, if not the fundamental building block for AI governance. And so data gets finally the recognition in the AI governance space, because my concern was that in the AI governance space, there was actually not enough understanding and recognition of data stewardship as kind of a fundamental function for responsible AI, but that now got recognized in the kind of global level as well. Now, the key is, of course, all right, so now we have those global statements. What do we do about it? These are two papers that are recently, and this is perhaps kind of the promotional activity here, but two papers that I recently have written together with some colleagues. One is about how do we actually go from the Global Digital Compact to a reality. And so if you're interested, I basically make kind of 4 suggestions to what's next, because it's important to have an announcement, but now you need to actually make it a practice. And the same thing, we also submitted to the G20, kind of a policy brief on how do we make sure that data stays on top of the global agenda. And that's where we called for kind of an international decade for data as well.